Alpha King Cassian stood in his darkened throne hall at midnight staring up at the foreign crest that hung above his father's throne. He did not hear Elena come in behind him. He never did any more, and when her voice reached him, it was already inside his ear. "She made you kneel," she whispered. "She made me nothing. Let's make her pay." Before dawn at his desk, Cassian pressed his seal into the hot wax of an order aimed at Moon Queen Lisa, the woman who had fed his starving kingdom through the winter, the Luna he had already betrayed once and lost. He told himself it was not revenge. He told himself he was defending his people, and he did not know that before the moon turned, that same seal would be handed back to him on a battlefield stained with a queen's blood, that his own banner would come down from his own wall, that he would stand in chains above his own gate between two armies while the woman he betrayed decided whether Frost Moon deserved to exist at all. This is the story of the worst decision of an Alpha King's life. Not the night he signed the order, the night was only the ending. The decision was made slowly, whisper by whisper, doubt by doubt, over 3 long months, by a man who wanted to be better, and let the wrong voice tell him how. It began on the morning Cassian rode home from Ethelgard 3 months before the seal touched the wax, when he still wanted only one thing, and it was not revenge. The Ethelgard crest hung above the fortress gate when Cassian rode home, silver thread catching the thin morning light. His own steward had sewn it there as the treaty required, and every guard in the courtyard had watched their Alpha King pass beneath another ruler's mark. Cassian did not look up at it. He had already pressed his forehead to the cold floor of the Moonstone throne room, and after a man has done that, a banner is only cloth. The relief wagons rolled in with the dawn as they had rolled in all winter. Grain in rough sacks, medicine in sealed clay jars, heating wood blankets, iron tools for rebuilding the burned quarter. Every crate carried the royal seal of Ethelgard pressed into blue wax, and the people of Frost Moon knelt beside the wheels and gave their thanks aloud. Not to him, to her. Near the warehouse doors, a mother stood with a boy wrapped in one of the gray wool blankets from the south, his face carrying color it had not carried a month earlier. She recognized her king and did not lower her eyes. "Queen Lisa saved my son," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only fact. Cassian inclined his head because it was true, and because there was nothing else an honest man could do. Farther along the wall, a smaller boy tugged free of his sister's hand and ran a few steps toward him. "Alpha," the child said, "when is Queen Lisa coming back?" Cassian stood very still. Not one soul in Frost Moon asked any more whether their Alpha would save them. They asked when she would return. So he went to work because work was the only apology he had left. She had told him before the gates of Ethelgard to build his kingdom on stone, and not on sand. And he took the lesson the way a drowning man takes a rope. He walked the damaged grain warehouses himself, counting rot and rat damage row by row. He traced the winter supply routes on maps older than his father. He restored the council that his pride had hollowed out, seated Elder Rowan at its head of table, and made himself sit through hours of trade reports he once would have waved away. Then he opened the records Lisa had kept as Luna, and the opening of them was its own punishment. 5 years of ledgers in her careful hand. Grain stores she had stretched through 2 hard winters. Disputes she had settled quietly so that they never reached his hall. Warnings she had written and signed and sent to a husband who had not read them. Every page was another weight she had carried alone while he had called her useful and believed he was being generous. He began staying awake until the lamps burned out, laying her old forecasts beside the disasters that had followed her leaving, and the match between them was almost perfect. Somewhere in those long nights, the last of his delusions went quiet. He no longer believed Lisa should come back to him. He no longer let himself imagine it. He wanted only to become brick by brick and ledger by ledger a man worthy of the faith she had once wasted on him. Elena watched him change and understood before anyone else what the change would cost her. No one in the palace called her Luna now. The title had never been granted, only assumed, and assumption had died with the treaty. Servants who had once bent their necks when she passed now simply stepped aside, eyes forward, as though she were furniture being moved. The council barred her from the warehouses and the relief routes by written order, and Elder Rowan had signed it first. In the corridors, she heard what the workmen called her when they thought she was out of earshot. The woman who made Frost Moon kneel. She heard it by the stables and again by the granary, and the words followed her up the stairs like smoke. She came to Cassian's chambers on a night when the wind off the mountains rattled the shutters, wearing what she used to wear when his attention was a simple thing to catch. He was at his desk with Lisa's rebuilding plans spread under the lamp, and he did not rise. She crossed the room, laid her hand against his jaw, and turned his face toward her. And he took her wrist and set it gently away from him, the way a man sets aside a cup he did not ask for. Then he went back to the plans. "You blame me," she said. Her voice broke on cue, and the tears came the way they always came at the useful moment. "I lost everything too, Cassian. I am as much a victim of that woman as you are." He did not look up. "Lisa saved the people we abandoned," he said. "Whatever else is true, that is true first." Elena stood in the lamplight for a long moment, and something behind her face went cold and still, while the tears kept sliding down it. She understood the arithmetic now. If Cassian truly rebuilt himself into an honest king, there was no room in that kingdom for the woman who had helped him ruin the first one. His reform was her erasure. So she did not argue. She learned. She began to leave single sentences behind her, the way other women leave perfume, each one placed where he would find it in the dark hours, when he was too tired to guard his own mind. "The people no longer see you as their king," she murmured over his shoulder one evening, as if grieving with him. "They obey Lisa, even when she is not here." She observed another night, gently, reasonably. And then, as she paused at his door with the candle in her hand, "How long, my love, before she decides Frost Moon no longer needs you at all?" She always closed the door softly behind her. She had learned that poison, like perfume, works best in small amounts, and that a question left standing in an empty room grows louder after midnight. Elena made one last attempt to take back her place in the open. She dressed carefully, walked to the council chamber on the morning the relief stores were to be reviewed, and found Elder Rowan standing in the doorway with his hand resting on the frame. He was an old man, thin as a winter branch, and he did not move. "This meeting concerns the feeding of Frost Moon," he said. "You have no seat here. I stood beside the Alpha King through the worst season this pack has known," Elena said loudly enough for the men inside to hear. "That has earned me a voice." "You wanted Lisa's title without accepting Lisa's responsibilities," Rowan answered, and he did not lower his voice either. "When the granary stood empty, our Luna crossed the mountains to beg help for people who had watched her humiliated. You slept warm in her chambers. That is what you earned, and the council remembers it." He stepped back, and the doors closed, and the sound of the bolt was very loud in the corridor. She was still standing there, when two workmen passed below the stair with a handcart of Ethelgard grain, and one of them said, it not even cruelly, just as a name the way one names a hill or a storm, "The woman who made Frost Moon kneel." In her chamber, Elena took the silver mirror from her table, the one Cassian had given her in the first month, and threw it across the room. It burst against the stone wall beside the Luna robes that hung there, robes she had ordered sewn for herself and had never once been permitted to wear before the pack. She stood among the bright pieces of her own reflection, breathing hard, and understood that something in her had changed shape. She no longer hated Lisa for keeping Cassian's heart. That wound was old. She hated Lisa because every wagon, every blessing, every grateful mother in the courtyard was a measurement, and what it measured was Elena, and the measurement always came back the same: small. She went to General Draven 3 nights later, wrapped in a servant's cloak through the snow, to the abandoned northern barracks where he kept his own company of veterans. Draven had served under Cassian's father in the border wars, and he still wore the old king's colors under his armor. He was broad gray at the temples, and he had the patient eyes of a man who had buried better kings than the one he currently served. It was said in the barracks that he had not looked at the Ethelgard crest above the gate since the day it was raised, the way some men will not look at a grave. "I want Lisa to lose everything she took from me," Elena said. Draven poured wine and did not offer her any. "She took nothing from you," he said. "She proved you never had it. There is a difference, and until you understand the difference, you are no use to me." The insult went through her like cold water, and she stayed anyway. That, more than anything she said, seemed to satisfy him. He talked, and she listened. A blade aimed at the Moon Queen, he explained, was a blade aimed at the whole Ethelgard army, and Frost Moon would be ash within a season. The queen could not be attacked. But a treaty is not a queen. A treaty lives inside one man's mind, and a mind can be worked on. Small incidents first. Accidents. Disappearances. Patrols where patrols should not be. Each one tied by a thin thread to Ethelgard, none of them proof alone. Let suspicion do the slow work that no army could do quickly. Make Cassian believe one doubt at a time that Lysa meant to take Frost Moon from him entirely, and then stand back and let the Alpha King break the treaty with his own hand. Ethelgard's queen would be blameless, betrayed, and far away, and Frost Moon would belong to whoever stood ready when the crown rolled off Cassian's head. You will attack him where he is weakest, Draven said. Not his reason, his shame. I will build the circumstances that make your whispers look like prophecy. Elena agreed before the wine in his cup was finished. She told herself she was using the general that when Lysa had fallen and Cassian was hers again, or the throne was hers without him, an old soldier could be managed. Draven watched her calculate all of it in plain sight and let her believe every line of the sum. What he did not tell her was that a rider had already gone east through the high passes to the camps of the Black Fang Legion, the landless army that had been probing the mountain borders for 2 winters. The message offered them what no siege could win: the hidden ways through Frost Moon's mountains opened from within. In return, they would send weapon soldiers who could wear Frost Moon armor convincingly and steal enough to hold a throne once it had been emptied. Draven had chosen his pieces the way he planned his campaigns, and both the Alpha King and the Weeping Woman across his table were pieces already placed, already spent in his mind. He gave Elena a single instruction before she left. Never tell Cassian that Lysa is a traitor. Not once. Say it. And he will defend her, and you will lose him. Your work is only to make him ask the question himself. A man believes nothing so completely as the suspicion he thinks he discovered on his own. Elena came back through the sleeping palace with snow still on her shoulders. In his study, Cassian had fallen asleep at his desk again, his cheek against Lysa's rebuilding ledgers, the lamp burned down to a blue thread. She stood over him for a while. Then she slid the first of Draven's forged reports quietly onto the desk, squared its edges with the ledgers so that it would be the first thing his eyes found at dawn, and went to bed believing the game was hers. The first fire began before sunrise in the relief warehouse nearest the east wall. Cassian arrived with the smoke still climbing and worked the line himself, dragging burning grain sacks into the snow, while the roof beams cracked overhead. When it was over, half a month of Ethelgard grain lay steaming and black in the yard, and Draven knelt beside a shattered oil container that no warehouse had any reason to hold. Someone wanted Frost Moon to lose these supplies, the general said, turning the broken clay in his gloved hand. He let the silence sit, then added almost reluctantly that a kingdom kept hungry stays obedient, and that no one profited from Frost Moon's dependence more than the crown that supplied it. Lysa would never starve the people she crossed the mountains to save. Cassian said it flatly, the way a man states the weight of stone. He ordered the warehouse rebuilt, and doubled the watch and walked away from the question in Draven's face. That was the first refusal. Within a fortnight, a northern merchant vanished. He was a grain factor, a talkative man, and he disappeared 2 days after meeting privately with Commander Kaelin of Ethelgard at the border post. Draven brought the report himself. "Why does the Moon Queen's commander need secret meetings with your merchants?" he asked. "And why do the men she meets stop being seen?" "The treaty gives Ethelgard the right to supervise the relief agreement," Cassian said. "Kaelin meets whom he must. Merchants travel. Not every empty house is a grave." The words were correct, and he noticed, even as he said them, how much effort correctness had begun to cost. That was the second refusal. Then guardians in silver were seen moving along the ridgeline near the northern fortress, counting or so, Elena said, when she brought him to the window to watch. "They are measuring your defenses," she told him, her hand light on his arm. Cassian summoned Kaelin to the palace and asked him directly, king to commander, and Kaelin answered directly because it was his way. The pass had become dangerous. Bandits were striking the civilian supply wagons, and Queen Lysa had approved a patrol to protect the grain roads. Nothing more. Cassian studied the man's weathered, unbothered face, and believed him, and said so. That was the third refusal, and Elena counted it as carefully as he did. Draven never once accused the Moon Queen. That was his discipline and his art. He only asked questions and left before the answers finished forming. On the stairs one evening with the torches guttering, he paused as though the thought had just found him. "My king, if Ethelgard truly intended to take Frost Moon entirely, tell me, what would the Moon Queen be doing differently from what we are watching her do now?" Cassian had no answer. The question followed him down the corridors for days, patient as a hound. feeding his people, protecting his roads, winning his citizens, placing her soldiers on his passes with his own signed consent. Kindness and conquest, he discovered, could wear exactly the same face, and once a man has seen that, he cannot easily stop seeing it. Long afterward, when men argued over the hour the Alpha King's fall truly began, some would name the fire and some the letter. They would all be wrong. It began with a question on a stairway and with the king who could not stop answering it. The letter finished what the question had begun. A clerk found it folded into the treaty archive, sealed with the Ethelgard crest unsigned. It spoke in a careful diplomatic hand of arrangements to be made after winter, of a transition of stewardship in Frost Moon, of the present Alpha remaining in place only until the season turned. Cassian read it 3 times at his desk while Elena and Draven stood silent. "Lysa did not write this," he said at last. "It is not her hand, and it is not her way." "A queen does not sign the orders she wants hidden," Elena said softly. "That is what clerks are for." Elder Rowan, when he was shown the thing, held it at arm's length, like a soiled rag. "A letter no one signed, found exactly where it would do the most harm, at exactly the hour suspicion needed feeding. My king asks who benefits from your doubt." But Draven wondered aloud later and privately why the old man was so eager to defend Ethelgard, and whether Rowan had already decided which ruler he would kneel to when the season turned, and Cassian, who a year ago would have laughed. The words out of the room did not laugh. He began to watch. That was all he told himself, only watching, only prudence, and what is a king for, if not vigilance? But the watching changed the world it looked at. The relief wagons rolled in each dawn, and now their orderly lines resembled a supply column feeding an occupation. The guardians on the pass stood their posts in the snow, and now they were not sentries, but a garrison waiting for a word. The citizens knelt and blessed the Moon Queen's name over their bread, and every blessing tallied a loyalty that no longer belonged to him and perhaps never would again. He stopped sleeping. He sat up with the lamps and the ledgers and the unsigned letter, and through the long blue hours, Elena's voice moved in his mind more freely than his own. One sentence, always the same sentence, wearing a groove. And the royal letter came on a gray morning, carried by a rider in Ethelgard silver and sealed in blue wax. Queen Lysa would visit Frost Moon before the thaw. She would inspect the distribution of the relief supplies, meet the restored council, and judge the progress of reconstruction before spring. The language was formal, correct, and gave nothing away. Cassian read it 4 times. Somewhere beneath the armor of protocol, he kept looking for her voice, and on the 4th reading he stopped, pretending he was looking for anything else. Part of him, the part that still woke at night with his forehead against remembered stone, wanted only to stand in front of her and say the 2 words he had never once said aloud: "Thank you," and the 2 harder ones after them. He began preparing that same day. Not a feast, not banners, a proposal. He gathered everything the winter had taught him into one bound plan in his own hand, the way she had kept her ledgers. The warehouses under repair with dates and grain counts, the trade routes reopening toward the southern passes, the council restored with Rowan's seal beside his own. On the first page he wrote the words she had left him with stone, not sand. And he meant the whole document as a message beneath the message. You were not wrong about what I could become. Elena found the proposal on his desk while he slept. She read the first page by candlelight, and her hand was steady, but she stood there a long time. She had spent a season sowing doubt, 1 seed at a time, and 1 letter from the south had put green shoots of hope through all of it in a single day. He still measured himself by Lysa's judgment. He was still after everything building toward her. She wept then, and the weeping was real, which made it dangerous. She remembered standing before Lysa and Ethelgard, dressed in borrowed dignity, and the way the Moon Queen had looked at her without anger, without interest, and said, "You are beneath my notice." The words had gone in like a thin blade and never come out. Now she took that blade and turned it outward and went to work on the only material she had ever truly mastered, which was Cassian's shame. She did not speak of her own humiliation. She spoke of his. "Lysa made you kneel before her whole court," she reminded him gently, mournfully over the following days. "Lysa's soldiers stand on your passes. Your own people kneel to her wagons in your own courtyard. And now she comes in state to inspect, to judge, to be adored. And when she leaves, what will you be, in their eyes, except the steward who kept her province warm?" Still he refused. Even sleepless, even hollowed, when Draven finally said the word arrest in the small hours, as a soldier names a contingency. Cassian's answer was immediate and cold. No. She was invited under my roof. There is a word for kings who touch a guest, and my father's house will not carry it. Then Draven brought the report. Citizens in the lower quarter, it said, were preparing to receive the Moon Queen as their own. Oaths whispered silver sewn onto cloaks talk in the taverns of better protection under a better crown. The report was false, from its first line to its last, and it was written in the dull, reluctant tone of a man who wished he could disbelieve it, which was Draven's particular genius. Cassian walked to the palace window with the pages still in his hand, and looked down and saw silver banners going up along the processional road. They were relief banners hung for a ceremony of thanksgiving that Rowan's council had planned for weeks. But Elena stood at his shoulder in the window light and said quietly, "They are preparing for her coronation over your kingdom," and from that height, with those pages in his hand, Cassian could no longer tell the difference. That is the fact that damned him. Not that he believed the lie at once, but that from where he had chosen to stand, the lie and the truth had become the same picture. He wrote the arrest order that night. Halfway through the seal, he stopped, read his own words, and tore the parchment through. An hour later, he wrote it again and tore it again and sat with the pieces in front of him until the candle drowned in its own wax. Then he walked past the guards into the empty throne hall. Moonlight came down through the high windows onto the throne of Frost Moon, his father's seat, his grandfather's. And above it, where the old pack banner had hung for 6 generations, the crest of Ethelgard silver on blue patient and foreign and permanent. He stood there a long time, and he heard her step behind him because she had followed him, because she had never once let him be alone with his better nature. "She made you kneel," Elena said very softly. "She made me nothing. Let's make her pay." "What is it you want?" he said. He did not turn around. "Nothing cruel," she said. "Nothing bloody. Only justice with the doors closed. Detain her courteously, royally, until she cancels the vassal treaty, withdraws her troops from the passes, and restores Frost Moon's sovereignty before the world. She saved this pack. Elena aloud, no one denies it. But salvation is not a purchase, and a debt of grain does not buy a kingdom." And Cassian, standing under the foreign crest in his father's hall, told himself the thing that ruined him. This is not revenge. This is a king defending his people's freedom. He said it to himself twice in those words because the first time it did not sound true. He signed the 3rd draft at his desk before dawn. Seal the gates once the Moon Queen is inside. Disarm her escort with courtesy without blood. Hold her within the palace honorably until terms are agreed. He read it twice, and then he pressed the alpha seal of Frost Moon into the hot wax, and the wax took the mark, and held it the way wax does not care what it holds. The first time Cassian betrayed Lisa, he had not known what she was worth. He had that excuse, and it was a poor one, and he had spent a winter learning how poor. This time he knew her worth to the last measure, knew it from her own ledgers in her own hand, and he pressed the seal down anyway. Lisa came to Frost Moon with a small company, and that smallness was itself a message. Queen Seraphina rode at her right hand, silver-haired and straight-backed, the old queen of Ethelgard, who had become her advisor. Commander Kaelin rode at her left with a light escort of guardians, fewer than 40. The Ethelgard army stayed south of the mountains by Lisa's own order. She had come deliberately, almost unguarded, to the kingdom of the man who had betrayed her once already, because that is what trust looks like when a queen decides to offer it one more time. The people of Frost Moon lined the processional road 3 deep. They pressed forward with winter flowers, with bread from grain she had sent, with children lifted up to see her. An old woman caught the hem of her cloak and kissed it, and named the medicine that had saved her grandson. The sound that moved along the road was not the roar a conqueror gets. It was lower and warmer, the sound a family makes. Cassian watched it from the balcony, and the order he had sealed lay in the keeping of his gate captain like a stone sunk in a well. Elena stood beside him, counting the crowd with her eyes. "Look at them," she said. "They have already chosen their queen." She said it as grief and wore it as grief. And under the grief her pulse ran quick with triumph, because his face had gone the color of the winter sky. They met in the throne hall alone. It was the first time since Ethelgard, since his forehead had touched her floor. Lisa crossed the hall the way she had crossed it for 5 years as its unthanked Luna, and stopped where the light from the high windows fell between them. She was thinner than he remembered. Queens eat last in a hard winter. He knew that now from her own ledgers. Her eyes went to the long table before he could speak. The rebuilding plans lay spread across it, his winter's work, the warehouse schedules, the reopened trade routes, The council minutes with Rowan's seal, all of it annotated in a hand that had grown page by page to resemble hers. She walked the length of the table, slowly reading, and he watched her read, and the silence in the hall was of a kind he had never earned before. "You studied the rotes," she said. "I studied everything you left. It was a better education than my father's war masters ever gave me." He almost said the rest then. The word forgive rose in him and stood at the gate of his teeth, and his pride that old gate captain would not open. What came instead was, "Frost Moon repays its debts. In time Ethelgard will see." "I did not come for repayment," Lisa said. "I came to see whether Frost Moon had begun building on stone." She looked up from the plans, and for one unguarded moment there was something in her face that was not queen, only woman, only the person who had once believed in him before believing in him was foolish. And I see that it has. The arrest died in him then. It happened as simply as that. He walked to the doors on the pretext of calling for wine, and gave his gate captain the sign they had arranged against this very weakness, flat palm held low. "Stand down. Let it pass." The captain nodded once. Through the corridor grate from the shadows where she had posted herself, Elena saw the sign and understood it, and was already moving. The word she sent Draven was one they had agreed on days before. What Draven did with it, Elena never knew that night, because Draven had never intended her to know. In the guardroom below, he relieved the gate captain on the king's authority, took custody of the sealed order, and issued his own amendments to a picked commander of his own veterans. The Moon Queen would not be detained in the throne hall. She would be permitted to leave Frost Moon freely with courtesies. Her escort would be attacked at Moonstone Pass beyond witnesses by soldiers in Frost Moon colors. The Moon Queen would not survive the attack, and on the body of the commander who led it, where Ethelgard's people would be certain to find it, would be left the arrest order bearing the Alpha King's own seal. Dead Lisa was a war. A war was all Draven had ever needed from any of them. Upstairs, the conversation ended, as such conversations end formally with terms of inspection agreed, and nothing said that mattered. But at the doors, Lisa paused and looked back at him across the hall and said, "Finish the eastern warehouse before the thaw. If the spring floods come early, you will lose the grain to damp." Advice. Freely given unasked the way she had always given it. Cassian stood under the Ethelgard crest after she was gone, and let himself believe for 1 hour the most expensive thing a man in his position could believe, that it was not too late. The attack came at dusk at the narrowest point of Moonstone Pass. Arrows first out of the high rocks on both walls, striking the road around the royal carriage in a hard drumming rain. Then soldiers rising from the scree on either side, and every one of them wore the gray and iron of Frost Moon. Kalen was off his horse before the second volley, dragging Lisa down behind an overturned supply wagon, shouting the Guardians into a ring. Seraphina, who had been a war queen before Lisa was born, came out of the carriage with a blade already drawn and set her back against the wagon at Lisa's left side and held it. The poisoned arrow came in the third volley. It came low and flat through a gap in the ring, aimed not at the soldiers, but past them at the queen kneeling in the road, and Seraphina saw it the way old soldiers see things, a half-breath early. She stepped into its path. It took her high in the shoulder above the heart she had put in front of it, and she went down against the wagon wheel with her blade still in her hand. Guardians died in the ring that held. When the attackers finally broke and ran, 11 silver cloaks lay still on the road, and Kalen came back from the rocks with blood on him that was not his, carrying what he had taken from the body of the enemy commander. A folded order, a seal pressed deep in wax, the mark of the Alpha of Frost Moon. Cassian was already riding for the pass by then. Word of fighting had reached the fortress, and he had taken horse, without guard, without helm, without any thought he could afterward name. He came up the dusk road into the wreckage, the fallen guardians, the arrow-struck carriage, and found Lisa kneeling in the road with the old queen's head in her lap and the old queen's blood soaking black into her silver cloak, and her hands, when she raised the folded order so that he could see his own seal, were red to the wrist. "Was betraying me once not enough? I ordered your arrest." His voice came out wrong, stripped of strangers. "God forgive me, that much is mine. I never ordered your death." "You still gave them permission to touch me," Lisa said, and the quiet in her voice was worse than any sentence a court could pass. The surviving guardians closed on him in a silver ring, and Kalen's sword came up level with the king's throat, and the commander asked his queen in a voice like a drawn bowstring for the only order he wanted. Lisa looked at Cassian for a long moment over Seraphina's body. She had seen his face when his eyes found the arrow's dark-stained fletching, seen the shock go through him like a blade finding a gap in armor. It was not the face of a man watching his plan succeed. "No," she said. "Not yet." Ethelgard called it what it was, an act of war. The surviving Guardians wanted Cassian's head on the road where their brothers had died, and the law of any kingdom on the continent would have given it to them. He was disarmed, bound at the wrists, and held under guard in the pass while riders flew south with the news that the Moon Queen had been ambushed under a seal of hospitality. Lysa refused them his execution, not out of softness. She made that plain in front of every Guardian present. She had seen his face when his eyes found the poison fletching, and a queen who has been lied to, as often as Lysa learns to read faces the way scholars read old script. He had ordered her seizure. He had not ordered her death. The difference would not save him, but it mattered because somewhere a man existed who had turned one crime into the other, and that man was still holding a kingdom. "He will stand trial," she said. "Ethelgard does not tear men apart on the roadside. That is the difference between us and whoever wrote the Second Order." It was Cassian himself kneeling in the wreckage with his wrists bound, who named the man. Draven held the gate garrison. Draven had relieved the gate captain. Draven's veterans had made up the escort commander's company. Every road of it ran back to the general, and Cassian, saying it aloud, heard exactly what his own voice was describing the machine that had been assembled around him gear by gear all winter while he stared at Lysa's banners and called his blindness vigilance. He begged for one chance, not mercy. He was past asking for that. One chance to ride back and tear Draven out of Frost Moon before the trap finished closing on his people. Cailan was against it with every scarred inch of himself. The king had burned one act of trust already, and Moonstone Pass was still littered with the cost. But Lysa set 3 conditions in front of witnesses in the old formal cadence of her office. Surrender Draven to Ethelgard's justice. Disband the soldiers who had risen outside the law. Protect the civilians of Frostmoon, whatever it cost him. Cassian swore to all 3 on his father's name, and she had his bonds cut, and gave him back his sword and watched him ride north with a handful of warriors still loyal to his person rather than his throne. The gates of Frost Moon were shut when he reached them. Draven's soldiers stood across the road in ordered ranks, and on the wall above the gate in the torchlight, the Alpha banner of Cassian's line was coming down. It descended in small jerks gathered in by unseen hands, and something older than rage went out of Cassian as he watched it go. Along the battlements where his own gray sentries should have stood soldiers in black and dark iron, and their shields carried a device no Frost Moon smith had ever hammered, the Fang. Black Fang inside his walls on his stones above his gate. Draven came out onto the wall, over the gate, unhurried in half armor, and read out the charges as though the road below were a courtroom. The Alpha King had broken the Ethelgard Treaty. The Alpha King had launched an unsanctioned attack on the Moon Queen's person and provoked a war Frost Moon could not survive. The Alpha King had therefore forfeited the right to rule, and the Council of War now held the fortress in trust for its people. It was smooth, legal-sounding, and every word of it was built from crimes Draven himself had manufactured. That was the shape of the trap entire. He had used Cassian's own betrayal as the lawful grounds to take Cassian's throne. Then Elena stepped up beside the general on the wall, and she was wearing a crown, not the Luna's circlet. A queen's crown, new-made bright and slightly too large, and Cassian understood with a lurch that somewhere in the fortress a smith had been making it for weeks. Elena. Her name came out of him like something breaking off a cliff. "Come down. Whatever he has promised you, come down from there." "I stood beside you when you had a crown," she called down, and her voice carried beautifully. She had always known how to be heard. "Now you have nothing." He asked her because some part of him still needed the answer said aloud, how she could do it after he had turned on the one woman who never deserved it for her sake at her word. Elena looked down at him for a moment, and for the only time that night she told him the whole truth. "You were always willing to betray the woman who loved you," she said. "Why would I ever believe you would not betray me too? I watched you sign that order, my love. I watched what you are. I simply chose to be standing on the right side of it." She had let them in through the mountains. She confirmed it almost carelessly through the hidden passages that only the Alpha's household knew. The ways he had shown her himself in the easy days when showing her secrets had felt like love. She had never loved him. She said that too plainly from the wall in front of his men. She had loved the position, the obedience, the place above other heads, everything Lysa had owned without seeming to want it, and if Cassian could not provide those things, the Fang shields behind her could. His loyal warriors 40 against a fortress tried the gate anyway, because that is what loyalty does when it runs out of choices. Draven's ranks folded around them, with a professional economy that made the outcome plain inside a minute. Cassian was dragged from his horse, and through his own streets, and the people of Frost Moon came out of their doorways to watch their Alpha King pass bound bleeding at the mouth between soldiers wearing a foreign fang. No one cheered. No one wept for him either. They watched in silence the way people watch weather that has ruined them before. In the throne hall under the Ethelgard crest, that no one had yet dared take down, Draven sat in the Alpha's seat, with his sword across his knees. Elena stood beside the throne in her too large crown, one hand resting on its carved arm, arranging herself into the picture she had coveted for years. And Cassian was forced to his knees on the stone floor in the precise place he could not stop his mind from marking it, where he had once made Lysa stand to hear her worth explained to her in the days when he had believed kneeling was for other people. Draven talked. Victors do. The forged letters had come north in Blackfang saddlebags, along with the poison, the false reports, the soldiers who had died wearing Frost Moon Grey at Moonstone Pass. Everything Cassian had taken for evidence, every thread he had followed through his sleepless nights had been laid down for him like scent for a hound. The general explained it without cruelty, which was the cruelest possible way, one commander briefing another on a campaign already concluded. "You were the easiest fortress I ever took," Draven said. "I never breached your walls. I only showed you a woman being kind to your people and let your pride call it conquest." Elena chose that moment to demand her coronation. The word public was in her sentence. The pack must see the crown placed, must kneel, must say the words. Draven did not even turn his head toward her. Afterward, he said, "When the war is finished, there is a great deal still to finish." And in the small silence afterward, Cassian, kneeling on his own stones, with blood drying on his lip, saw Elena's hand tighten on the arm of the throne, saw the first hairline crack run through her triumph, and understood one thing with absolute clarity. Through the ruin of everything else. She did not command the man beside her. She had never commanded him. Elena had spent a season moving Cassian across the board and had not once noticed the larger hand moving her. Lysa carried Seraphina home to Moonstone Palace herself and did not leave the healer's hall until the sun rose. The Black Fang poison was old craft, slow and patient, and it had taken the old queen down into a sleep the healers could not promise she would surface from. Lysa sat beside the bed with the stained silver cloak still on her shoulders because she had not thought to remove it, holding a hand that had taken an arrow meant for hers. The Council of Ethelgard met at noon, and their verdict was thunder. Burn Frost Moon. End it. Twice the Moon Queen had extended her hand across the mountains, and twice it had come back bloodied. Kalen stood at the foot of the council table, still in his ruined field armor, and said it without ornament. "They betrayed your mercy twice. There is no third betrayal, my queen. There is only what we permit." And for the first time in her reign, Lysa did not defend Frost Moon. She sat at the head of the table and let the silence stretch, and behind her, still face, the memories came in order like witnesses. Cassian's chamber door and what she had heard through it. His voice in the old days explaining that her value lay in her usefulness. The wax seal on the order that had put her behind an overturned wagon in the dusk. Seraphina folding down against the wheel with the fletching in her shoulder. When she finally spoke, it was not to the council but to herself, and it frightened them more than any sentence of destruction would have. "I am tired," she said, "of saving people who keep choosing to hurt me." And then quieter. "How many people must I lose before mercy becomes foolishness?" No one at the table answered her. She rose and went out alone. She walked to the crucible of stars in the last light, the silver pool in the mountain's heart, where her bloodline had faced itself for 20 generations. She stood at its rim and looked down into the still water and did not enter it. The woman looking back at her from the surface was not the frightened, discarded Luna, who had once come here to learn whether she was worth anything at all. That question had been answered and would stay answered. What stood at the rim now was a queen afraid of a different thing entirely, that her own compassion had become a door she could not close, and that innocent people kept walking through it into harm. Mercy had saved Frost Moon once. Mercy had also armed it, fed it, trusted it, and Mercy had put the arrow in Seraphina's shoulder as surely as any bow. The signal came after midnight. A single rider, half dead with cold, carrying a scrap of cloth, marked, in the old way, of the Frost Moon Elders, and beneath the mark, in Rowan's cramped, careful hand, the state of the kingdom. Blackfang held the granaries. Children and old ones had been herded into the lower quarter and were being kept there, as surety against rising. The people were resisting anyway in cellars and stables and shrine corners with hunting knives and habit, and nothing else. And on the doors of the houses hung quietly at night, where the invaders had not yet learned to look, the people had begun to fasten her symbol, the silver moon of Ethelgard, not as politics, as a hand raised from deep water. Rowan's message ended without one word for his king. Come for the people, the old man wrote, who still remember what you taught us. Lisa did not sleep. She sat with the message, and with everything the winter had cost, and the two great weights of her life, ground against each other through the dark hours, justice and mercy, the Queen's ledger and the Luna's heart. At dawn she rose and called for the Moon Queen's battle armor, which had not been worn in her lifetime, and the sight of it moving through the palace corridors told Ethelgard everything before a single order was read. She stood before her council in silver and steel and gave them her decision in 3 sentences built to be remembered. I am not returning for Cassian. I am returning because innocent lives do not inherit the guilt of their king. Frostmoon's people wear my mark on their doors, and I will not teach the mountains that my mark means nothing. Before she rode, she went to the healer's hall one last time. Seraphina had surfaced briefly the way strong swimmers do even in poisoned water. The old queen's eyes found the armor and understood it at once, and her hand closed on Lisa's with surprising iron. Good, she whispered. Hear me, girl. Mercy is not weakness. Mercy becomes weakness only when it has no boundary. Go and show them where the boundary is. Lisa rode out of Moonstone Palace at the head of the Ethel Guardians as the sun cleared the peaks, and her decision rode with her already made hard as the frost on the road. Frostmoon would be saved a second time whole. Blackfang would be driven from the mountains it had crept through, and Cassian, whatever else came of it, whatever he did now, however the debt was counted, would never rule again. Lisa did not hide her coming. She split her strength in the high passes, and the main column of Ethelgard came up the south road in open daylight, silver banners plain against the snow, slow and deliberate, built to be seen. Every eye on Frostmoon's walls turned toward it, which was the point of it. Draven answered spectacle with spectacle. He brought Cassian up from the cells and chains, and stood him on the wall, above the sealed gate between the fang shields, where both armies could see what remained of the Alpha King. If the Moon Queen wanted her traitor, let her buy him with a siege. And Elena in the Luna robes, no one had ever granted her, leaned over the parapet with the wind tearing at her voice and gave the order she had been swallowing since Moonstone Pass. Aim at the Moon Queen. A ragged volley went out from the wall. Lisa did not move. The guardian shields came up around her in one motion, and the arrows fell among them like hail on a roof, and when the shields lowered, she was still sitting her horse in the open looking up at the wall. Not at Elena, at the Frost Moon men standing among the invaders with bows in their hands. One by one along the parapet, those bows came down because the men holding them had children at home who were alive because of her grain, and no order Draven had breath to give was going to change that arithmetic. Cassian in chains between 2 armies watched his people refuse the war his seal had invited, and it was the proudest and the most ashamed he had ever been in one breath. Draven read the wall correctly as he read everything correctly except loyalty, and had Cassian dragged back down into the dark before the rot could spread. But the column on the south road had never been the attack. While every eye on the walls watched the banners, the Ethel Guardians came into Frostmoon, the way water comes into a cellar silently through the eastern mountain route that Draven had left thin because no army was supposed to know it. Kaelin reached Elder Rowan and the civilian resistance before the invaders knew the mountains had turned against them, and the cellars and stables and shrine corners of Frostmoon emptied their hidden knives into the streets. They found Cassian in the cells below the throne hall, and Kaelin stood at the bars a long moment with the keys in his fist and made no move to use them. It was Lisa coming down the stair behind him who ended it. "Open it," she said. "He must live long enough to face what he has done." They released him without armor, without command, without so much as a knife. He asked for none of it. He walked up into his ruined city, and the city showed him what his winter of suspicion had purchased. Burned roofs in the artisan quarter. Warehouses he had rebuilt with his own accounting standing empty as skulls. His people gray with hunger, and Blackfang soldiers on the corners where his sentries once stood. An old man he half remembered, a tanner whose dispute Lisa had once settled, looked at him from a doorway without hatred, which was worse than hatred. If our Luna had never left, the old man said, none of this would have happened. Cassian did not defend himself. There was no sentence in any language that would have been both loyal and true. Then the fighting reached the lower quarter where the children and the old ones were held, and Black Fang, breaking, began to spend its hostages. Cassian went toward the screaming. He tore the bar from the prison yard gate with his hands and a soldier's dropped axe, and led the children and the elders down through the old tunnel his grandfather had cut for sieges, and when a fang-shielded soldier came down into the dark after them, Cassian put himself in the narrow place and took the blade, meant for a girl of 6, along his ribs, and did not let the man pass. On the far side in the daylight, the girl looked back at the bleeding stranger who had carried her the last 100 steps. She did not know him. That was the gift the years would keep giving him. She thanked him the way children thank grown men, carelessly, completely, and ran toward a doorway where her grandmother stood beneath a small silver moon nailed over the lintel. In the throne hall, the conspiracy was eating itself. Elena stood before the throne, demanding the coronation she had been promised tonight before the pack, while there was still a pack to kneel. And Draven, with the fortress cracking around him, finally laughed at her one short soldier's laugh and told her the truth she had been standing beside all winter. Black Fang did not crown queens. There had never been a crown coming. There had only ever been uses for her, and she was very nearly used up. She turned white-faced and found Cassian in the doorway, bloodied, unarmed, upright. And Elena, who had told him from the wall that she had never loved him, asked him to protect her. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. And it was not cruelty. It was the first honest transaction between them in years. Lisa entered her old hall in Bat. Frost Moon survived. That was the word the riders carried south, and it was the truest word available because nothing larger than survival could honestly be claimed. The walls were broken in 3 places. The grain stores were ash and would be ash until the next harvest. Too many warriors lay under new stones in the burial field, and the people who buried them had stopped believing quietly and permanently in the old way of things, where one man's pride could spend everyone's children. The trials were held in the great hall before the assembled pack. Elena stood charged with treason, with conspiracy, alongside Black Fang, with the attempt on the Moon Queen's life, and with opening Frost Moon's gates to its enemies, and the evidence walked through the hall witness by witness, until there was nothing left of her but the verdict. At the end, being led away, she stopped in front of Cassian and asked him in the low voice she had always saved for him alone to remember what they had shared. He looked at her without anger, which was its own sentence. The first time I believed you, I lost Lisa. The second time I lost my kingdom. There will not be a third. Draven was sentenced after her for the coup and for the war, and the old general took it standing like weather, which was the only dignity he had left. Then Lisa rose, and Frost Moon learned the price of its king. The vassal treaty was dissolved not in vengeance, but in law. Cassian had violated its oath, and a treaty broken by one hand binds neither. Frost Moon would pass under Ethelgard's direct protection through the years of rebuilding. Elder Rowan would lead the new council, and Cassian, standing unarmored in the hall, where 3 rulers had now sat his family's throne, was stripped of all of it. The title of Alpha King, the command of warriors, the rights of succession, every privilege of the blood permanently before the pack. He accepted it on his feet. He asked to speak and was permitted, and what he said was short enough that the pack remembered it whole. They gave me lies. I chose to believe them. They offered revenge. I signed the order. What was done to Frost Moon began at my desk, and no one owes me comfort for the consequences. Lisa met him one last time at the gate on the morning Ethelgard rode south. He did not ask her to stay. He had reached finally the honesty that asks the real question. Was there anything left he could do in whatever years remained that would make her forgive him? Lisa looked at him for a while, and when she answered, her voice held no cruelty at all, which is how he knew it was final. Forgiveness is not the same as restoration. Some bridges are not meant to be crossed again. He bowed his head. Stone and sand, he said quietly, half to himself. You warned me at the beginning. And Lisa, already turning toward her horse, gave him the last instruction she would ever give him. Then begin with 1 stone. She rode south with Kaelin at her side, and Seraphina mending and impatient about it, in the carriage behind, and she did not look back at Frost Moon, not once. The months went by, the way months go by after history is finished with a place. And in those months, A man who had once worn a crown worked in the rebuild gangs of Frost Moon like any other pair of hands. He carried timber for the warehouse roofs. He stood waist-deep in snowmelt setting footings for the repaired bridge. He learned masonry from a man who did not like him, and did not soften, and taught him anyway. No one called him Alpha. No one called him much of anything, and he found to his own surprise that he could live inside that silence, that the silence was in fact the only place he could live. On the day the fortress wall was finished, it was Cassian who set the final stone because the masons, with the rough justice of working men, decided the worst decision of his life had earned him at least that much penance. A little girl watched him work the stone into its bed, the same girl, though he never knew it, whom he had carried through the tunnel dark. "Who taught you how to build a kingdom?" she asked. Cassian looked down the south road, the one the silver banners had taken. "The woman I betrayed," he said. The girl considered this with a child's terrible directness. "Will she ever come back?" He shook his head. "No, and that is the price I will carry." Far down that south road, an Ethelgard convoy was passing in the winter light, and from her carriage window Lisa saw the rebuilt wall standing whole above Frost Moon and the small figures along its top setting the last of the mortar. She did not stop. She did not send word, but she watched the wall until the road turned, and she nodded once, to no one to the fact of it, that the people had come through, that they were building on stone. Cassian never knew she passed. He stood with his palm flat against the final stone in the cold and understood the whole of it. At last a kingdom can be rebuilt, and a man can be rebuilt, but some futures once betrayed do not return. The wall would stand. The price would stand with it. If this story stayed with you, stay close, because the next one is already waiting for you here.